and also will discuss options for and against common approaches to data quality in the NFDI. Some words about today's speaker. Professor Carsten Oliver Schmidt is professor at the Institute of Community Medicine at the University Medicine of Greifswald. He is also the deputy head of the Department of Study for Health in Pomerania, or in clinical epidemiological research. He leads the functional division quality in health sciences. And beside his functions, he also is a researcher, of course, and his research focuses on methods and research quality related projects. For example, developments related to metadata standards, quality management procedures, data quality, etc., data quality tools, etc. And his further research topics are subclinical and clinical disorders, as well as incidental findings, which is also a very interesting topic. So I would like to hand over to you, Carsten Schmidt, immediately, so that you can simply start.
Okay, so thank you very much for the kind introduction. As you've noticed by this introduction, data quality is one of the main stakes I work with. It is also a main topic within NFDI for Health. And the precise reason why I thought this topic might be of interest, of course, from the point of view from our science field, but as I said, the lead question is here, can there be a common basis with data quality? Because this seemingly simple concept is quite tricky. And maybe as a kind of starting point, our understandings of what is precise may differ quite a bit. Let's, for instance, look at physics. This is just a brief copy from Wikipedia related to the measurement of how a meter is defined. Well, before it was measured, now it's just a definition, but it's kind of interesting to look at the uncertainty. These are really very, very low numbers, and you commonly with adequate measures, you are able to have a very small scope of error. Now let's look a little bit at medicine. For instance, something quite important. Let's think of glucose. And you have elevated levels, for instance, in the blood as an indicator for diabetes. So if it surpasses 200 milligrams per deciliter, you would say this might be diabetes. Then there are kind of guidelines for what is accepted as an imprecision in laboratory measures. And I think it is very probable that you overestimate the required precision. In fact, it's like this. It was like this, plus minus 45 centimeters. I mean, if you were building a bridge like this, okay, I want a 100-meter bridge, and if it is between 60 and 140 meters, it's fine. I think construction work would be quite interesting. In 2019, they have imposed some more strict guidelines, but nevertheless, the variability is quite strong. And just to give you an example here, with different blood, laboratory measures based on urine, you see here the relative permissible deviance, which may well be above 20%. And I think this is one core issue. If we deal with many things we measure in our field, uncertainty is something that accompanies us in medicine and adjacent fields. So this as a small appetizer to today's talk. So background. I am within the NFDI for Health, and I would like to illustrate a little bit what this means with person-related health data and also make a bridge towards a study example. NFDI for Health is about personal data from cohorts, clinical trials, and public health service. So it's observational studies, but it's also experimental studies in terms of not experiment in the sense a chemist, you would see it in chemistry, for instance, but rather you have a random allocation of subjects, and then this would be an experimental design. So what is characteristic of us is that in many of the studies in the field, we have very broad characterization in terms of health of our participants, very careful examinations and the characterization that may be phenotypes, but it's also at the molecular basis. It may be images, and it's quite broad. The data holding organizations mainly are research institutions and then clinical trial centers. So what we do is research focused. It is not healthcare. That is, again, something quite different from what we do. We deal in NFDI foremost with research data, although bridges and linkages to the other data sources is something we have in mind. And what is there also that in terms of data use and data access, many of the partners here have quite elaborated access policies, and also in terms of data protection. Of course, this is person-related data. This plays a major role. So what does a study may look like? For instance, I show the one I dealt most with till now. It's the study of health in Pomerania. An example of a larger epidemiologic study. You can see here, it started in the late 90s. So many of our prospective studies, they are not kind of a project that you start today and it ends in a year, but it may last over decades. And you repeatedly examine a population, and in a certain area, might be here, this is regional, there are other surveys that are nationwide. And a main interest is the occurrence of an association between subclinical finding, diseases, risk factors, consequences. This means a lot of times in these bigger epidemiologic studies, it's not that you have a single research question in mind why you design all this, but rather you try to focus as broad as possible and accumulate a lot of data to potentially answer questions that you didn't even think about in the beginning. So for instance, we have a wide series of cardiovascular examinations. It may be related to the skin, sleep laboratory, but here to the top right, for instance, you see an example of a person who undergoes a whole body MRI, which is quite challenging, being 90 minutes in this robot-like position. Overall, examination times may take longer than a day. So it's, and people have to come twice or 3 times. So a wide field of data plays a role, and that is then the scope that we have in our NFDI, that we have the spreadsheet type data from interviews, from examinations, but we also have images from, for instance, MRI, we have photos, we have audio from interviews, and so it's a very, very broad scope of data we need to deal with. And this means also there is no kind of unidimensional approach. And as an example, not from our study, there's one as well. In terms of access, major studies a lot of times have created their proprietary data portals to allow persons and scientists who are interested to get an overview on what's in the box. Okay, so what is it we do in NFDI for health? With the different data holders in the field we have in mind, we try through collection of metadata to improve a central findability of what studies are there and what do they contain, because this is a real shortcoming. A lot of this is missing. And this, of course, also means that we need to annotate studies and what's inside in a comparable manner, something that's not available. And here is the first time where data quality services appear. And there are further issues, for instance, standards and services in what we create, how to in a more uniform manner enable data publications. While we have many, many standards in our fields, especially where it gets closer to medical, to health services, because otherwise simply our systems would not run. Even though this is the case, there's a lack of standards. And of course, here, things have to be improved about data quality. And maybe a final note, I don't have the time today to go over details here, is that one aspect of particular importance with personal health data is that we need to find improved ways to allow for distributed analysis. That means data not being sent around the world to be analyzed, but to stay where they are because they have quite sensitive information. And then to find central ways on how to analyze those data. And again, here, a common data quality, common standards play a major role. Okay, so this far, I wanted to give a basic introduction on the background of NFDI for health. So let's have a look. What is data quality? We can see it in a quite simple way. Data quality can simply be conserved, talking in ISO terms, as the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics of data fulfills requirements. So if data fulfills the imposed requirements, we're fine, and the data quality can be considered high. And I personally like this very simple, straightforward definition a lot because of its inherent flexibility, and it's not bound to any specific area of research. And so, I mean, if we talk in this way about data quality, of course, next comes what are requirements. And on the one hand side, you may have kind of meta science requirements to have data findable, to have data, to be able to search for data, to really see what is inside, what did they exactly measure, what devices did they use, how did they proceed. Its aspects of accessibility and of exchangeability and of course reusability. And here we are kind of in the middle of what fair data means. And this is really very much at the heart of what NFDI is about. And it receives a lot of attention. And I mean, with there are many fair initiatives around. So and projects that are designed to improve fair metrics to make it visible. I will just give an example of an EU-funded project, Data Europe EU, where they have a dashboard approach to make fairness of distinct resources visible according to defined criteria, like is it machine readable, which media types, and other categories. So that is one aspect in terms of meta science. It's quite important, but personally, what I'm talking today more about is kind of the core aspect of science. So data is suitable for me. I mean, it's nice if I can find data, but that's not the end of science. It's, am I able to, above all, successfully provide answers to the research questions I make? That's why I'm a scientist. And as a sidetrack, a lot of what is getting analyzed, of course, is based on a determined research question, but you may also see things outside research questions, and even then you want to be able to make correct inferences. So it is requirement follows from what you target. And this means that it is context that matters. Of course, the research question, each research question is embedded in a certain field of research with a background within this field, and it cannot be discarded. So we always have to take this keep this in mind. And in terms of our own data that we have in our particular field is that, of course, when it comes to data, we always have limitations that come through potential risk of re-identification working with person-related data. This is a very peculiar topic. I will not deal with this as part of this talk, even though when it comes to data quality and improved options of analysis, this is really a very important thing. So going from here to a problem statement, what is the issue? I already in side remarks referred to it. If, for instance, I only look at our own field, which is, I would say, halfway homogeneous. Oh, there are many important studies, and many of those that participate here, they have a strong IT background and really know how to work with data with a decade-long history. But what we have after having also coordinated several network projects, it's really, we do not have a common understanding of data quality, if you want to be precise on that. We do not have the common data models to simply exchange. We have a series of common data model approaches, of course, yes. But the matter is, what is the science at sometimes proposed and what is the science lived? And there are some discrepancies. How do I assess data quality? There is no common standards. It's even not clear to many who run complex studies what's happening inside in detail, because it's on the desk of individual scientists to make decisions on how they address a certain problem, and it never leaves their computer what exactly has been done. And then what's also concerning the ways to exchange and to present results in data quality, there is no common way. Like when you publish in a paper, how should data quality be made visible? It is a field that is more often characterized by omission instead of a spot-on overview of what's going on in the box. And now it's kind of, if I say this about our own field already, looking at the entire scope of the NFDI, this seems pretty daring. If what comes together here, plant research, health data, chemistry, biodiversity, or on the second round, that you have then physics related content related to business and so on. And these are entirely different fields. So if we don't even, from a data quality perspective, to be homogeneous in our own field, why do we even think about this? It is necessary, I think, but I also have to concede one important point. Can there be a common basic? Well, with a term of data quality being focused on the importance of the context through requirements, of course, it directly interferes with any broad common basis, because as said, we cannot discard the identity and the requirements within those different data fields. Yet, as I think I can work on throughout this talk, some things can be done reasonably. So let's have a closer look on data quality. There have been very many different approaches, and some rather kind of putting views from different fields of research together, where, for instance, here Byron Oderwald, work from Wang, he distinguished intrinsic data quality and contextual representational accessibility. And it's a little bit more interesting to look down to the bottom line in here, where you see mentionings, accuracy, objectivity is a resource. Reputation, it's a rather soft term, but it's depending on the field, something like this may play a role as well. You have aspects that are mentioned quite frequently, completeness, for instance, or appropriate amount of data. This is pretty evident that that may play a role, but timeliness, of course, I mean, to have data in time to make certain decisions, it really depends on the field that you're in, how much this matters. And so you have here, how can the data be interpreted? So it's a level which is quite important, but which already gets away from core of data quality, like for instance, accuracy. And again, something entirely different to me is accessibility. It's a very different dimension, and by itself, of course, doesn't tell anything about the usability of data. So let's have a look at conceptually. We have to distinguish kind of discipline-specific approaches that take care for what is in there, but we also have to look at data-specific aspects, because of course, how the data is collected affects how you can look at them. So is it really designed data for some purpose, where you try as much as possible spot on to design to meet the necessities that come from certain research question? As far as administrative data is concerned, it is, for instance, here, it is maybe collected for reimbursement purposes. So it is something entirely different from science. And to look at this data and to make sense of it, to for instance, have a correct inference about morbidity can be quite complicated. And then again, the situation is quite different if you just take data as they come without a strictly regulated environment and to make a sense out of this, which plays an ever increasing role right now. So here we have certain differences. And when we were making our own approaches, we compare terms from different concepts and fields, and what is really a first grade problem, that in terms of the ways to describe data quality, we are really inconsistent, meaning that different terms may have the same meaning, but the same term like validity or accuracy may have 50 meanings, depending on where and by whom it is used. So by it's subjectively an almost entire disorder we face here, and very hard to get through. And this explodes if you leave a single field of research. So if we look within certain data quality frameworks, now I stay within my own field, I want to show a few examples where and how they addressed this. So for instance, here by Weiskopf, one data quality framework that is targeted at healthcare data, so foremost administrative data. One core dimension here, completeness, another one, correctness, and then current timeliness, that is that the time where the data is collected is appropriate. And then you have kind of different objects in here, a view across time, a view across variables or data items, and a view across, well, here then patients as the primary objects of interest. And by combining those, they have created a straightforward way to conceive certain dimensions. So for instance, is there sufficient data for each patient? But then already here is you have certain problems, because sufficient, being complete by itself does not mean sufficient. It is something entirely different. So you have certain conceptual issues to overcome, where different levels of requirements are all of a sudden mixed up with each other. And because sufficient is a lot of times defined from the analysis you do, but not from the assessment or the collection of data. And then you address, for instance, with correctness, that the data, the change over time seems okay. And I will not go over this all in detail, but a key point in here is that core dimensions that are looked at is completeness and correctness. And then, of course, you have to bring this together with different focus points. Another approach that we did in the field of our research was to really bring, based on another guideline, people together to provide judgments about the importance of different aspects of data quality. The list was over 50 items long. These were the most important ones, with the highest one was the highest grade importance. And what was described as important, for instance, things that deal with missing data, that things that are indicative of errors in the data, like contradictions, they must be consistent, distributions must be okay, or outliers as indicators of problems. Or for instance, that different sites collect data, and of course, also between those sites, data must be comparable. So key points that get mentioned here again is kind of the, is data there, and is data correct? And we use this to set up a concept where we distinguished some core dimensions. And this starts with integrity. So is data formally suitable for intended analysis? Then completeness, is necessary data available? And consistency, is data free of convention breaks and contradictions? And the last thing is accuracy. Are you in line with expected observed distribution? So the level of abstractness in here is of a kind that it does not make any reference to specific type of data or use of data or source of data, but rather it is a very abstract view on a certain aspect. And this is again split up on different levels. I will just be very, very brief on that you see here the level of dimensions and the concept. I will change the view for a second because this might be a little bit too small on the screen. That I will just go in here that, for instance, if you look at completeness, a lot of times you have data where you don't even know why data is missing. You don't have an appropriate coding, so you have to deal with that. Or you really know why data is missing, and you can, based on this, derive certain indicators. Or range and value variations may be related to very distinct types of data. And it is you can, from this very broad approach, so get more and more specific and more closer and closer to what data aspects you want to view. And that, I switch back again. And that is one approach in this concept that we also use in NFDI, that you have at the top level a data quality dimension, kind of a domain where you define a broad methodological approach, and then you formulate indicators. And again, different from the indicator is really how do you algorithmically deal with it. So, and this is a bridge. It is nice to have a set of indicators or a theoretical framework, but it only lives if you can apply it to data. And that is the next aspect. So how do you get from the framework to some assessment? And looking at those three levels, I have focused in the last comments. If you look at completeness and consistency, above all, you have logical checks and you have absolute or relative frequencies to make presentations. And with accuracy, which is about unexpected distributions, unexpected associations, you have a very rich set of statistics. You might use intra-class correlations, parametric regressions, any form of statistical test, or here negative, positive predictive values, and many other approaches might come in place here. And of course, if I were from physics, I would mention other sets of statistics. But it's kind of the way we look at the data is quite different depending on which aspect we want to focus on. And the key aspect here is then, okay, if we have study data, if we have our measurement, it is fine, but it is quite important to have the metadata available against which these checks can be performed, also with a sense to automatize these approaches. And what does this mean? This means if I think in a spreadsheet type reality that you might have your different variables with any measurement or so, and then you have additional ways, additional spreadsheets where simply attached to each variable, you have additional meanings of what is in here or of certain checks with which the content in here is compared. So very simple and basic is what is stored here compatible with the data type, or is do certain limits apply to those variables? And this set of metadata can be quite extensive, that you have very different information that you can provide together with the primary variables, like, for instance, date timestamps, when was it collected, information about environmental conditions, really have an extensive list of what missing codes means, what permitted jumps means, permitted values, check limits, assumptions about distributions, and so on. So you can add a lot of these informations. And I mention it because a lot of times only a small fraction of this information in the studies I oversee is stored in a very highly structured form. Or in a machine-readable form. A lot of time it is written hard-coded on a certain variable in a script, and therefore things add up with a zero transparency. So it is quite important to think how to organize the knowledge if you want to jump from the framework and theoretical aspect to the real implementation side. And the shortcoming at this level is also reflected by we are currently performing a review of, for instance, R packages. It's when we want to implement data quality, of course, high effort should be given to easily accessible means to assess data quality. And for instance, extensive, in our package, we have searched on CRAN. Very explicit, extensive use of metadata is only made by very few in the field. And many generate some data overviews and report, but without this, any inspection of the data will remain quite shallow. And this can also be seen here against the domains that I have presented before. That, for instance, if I don't have any knowledge about why data is missing, it's just NAs or any other way data simply is not there. It's one of the most common ways to have a presentation of missing data, and most packages will deal with that. And very few will be able to handle more elaborate codings of missings, which is quite crucial to generate correct figures a lot of times. And most of those domains, like range value violations, therefore contradictions, are only targeted by very few packages. So a a core when we want to get forward with data quality assessments is really apart from the theoretical part, to very closely think about the metadata behind it. And what we can, of course, not overcome is, I now have shown this with R packages with low complexity approaches, that, of course, in many bigger studies, this is here from CERN, one example on their way to data quality monitoring in with a very particular workflow that is tailored to their own way of collecting data. Here's something in CHIP where how our data is stored and how it is processed through different stages. This is very embedded in a complex study, and this will remain there. But I think in many other circumstances where the studies may not be that complex, it would be quite of interest not to have just this one static insight approach, but how to make a more flexible approach of those tools that could address a wide scope of data quality indicators in a comparable manner. So, options for a common ground. The first thing is, in an abstract way, there's quite a bit of overlap on core dimensions of data quality. We need to work with data that can be used, that are represented in the form that permits a use. Data must be complete, or should be as complete as possible, and measurements should be correct. And looking at this framework, I would say the context dependency is quite low in the upper stage, but it increases when you move down. Implementations of any indicators will, of course, be within a very particular context, but overall dimensions and general views of data quality, I think this is something that can be talked about across boundaries of single areas of research. Then the next thing is identify overlapping demands in similar data structures, no matter which field we are in. The appropriate statistical methods will remain similar on similar data structures. And so there is a lot to be learned from each other, because we are trained with a different background. And I think many ideas could be brought together there. And of course, the next thing, what I mentioned with metadata, is improve joint standards. And this is quite essential to then also use comparable methods and, for instance, packages with comparable outcomes to better compare what is in the box in terms of data standards. And so it means an agreement on how is this additional information represented. To a certain degree, using a few, it will not be all the same, certainly. But it is possible to agree on certain standards depending on the classes of indicators one is interested in. And then, of course, agree on reference methods is simply the statistical term. If we deal with the reliability of measurements, I mean, there's a standard set of methods to analyze this. So it may not be that science field specific what happens afterwards once the area of analysis has been defined. And this is, of course, also important because from similar methods with comparable metadata background, results are more easily comparable. And another thing is across those different NFDI structures that we have, as said, we have received a very different training, and I personally would find it very interesting to enter an exchange with representatives from different fields to see where common cores could be. So coming back to the question, data quality in the NFDI, can there be a common basis? I think yes. Any field is specific, and there is a point where it will never overlap with others. But there is a heart in there where we can overlap, and I think where we can learn from each other. And well, I would be very interested to hear opinions on what I presented. So right now, thanks for your attention.
And thank you very much for your really great talk and very interesting insights, and what NFDI for health is, how NFDI for health is perceiving data quality dimensions. And I think it was also a very nice introduction also in why NFDI exists, because you were highlighting all the topics which are really relevant for all of us. And like the last slide where you mentioned, okay, let's learn from each other. I think this is what we now can do in our discussion. So are there any questions or comments from the audience? We have about 15 minutes for our discussion now, and I'm looking forward to your contribution. Okay, there are no hands raised. Okay. There's a raised hand. Holger Israel.
Hello, thanks for the very interesting talk. You've presented a model with these 4 dimensions of data quality, which are integrity, completeness, consistency, and accuracy. I didn't quite catch where these 4 dimensions come from. Is it do they result out of your own research, or is it a model you quote from somebody else? Could you please say a bit more about that?
Yes, of course. This was derived from different sources. First, from reviews of data quality models in the field, what are commonly mentioned aspects. The second one was what I briefly referred to, the evaluation of an existing guideline, what is perceived as important and what is not perceived as being important. And then something entirely different, I forgot to mention it. It is the workflow perspective from our own uses. So what is the sequence of indicators to address if I want to implement an automated workflow? You have to address problems in a certain sequence to not come up with the same problem with 5 different phases at that 5 different stages, which distorts any then meaningful analysis. So it was theoretically guided and it was practically guided, and it was by what I showed with the terms in the beginning when we worked with data models, with data quality aspects. We kind of looked at the many definitions there were around and tried to find some common ground, and eventually we just gave up because there is none. Not when you look at the terms, but we rather thought it to be important to have something that is, if I say it in German, aus einem Guss. It must be coherent in itself to be applicable. And if I take kind of 20 definitions from 10 sources, it will never be coherent. So that's how this thing is emerged, and it's a bit more described in the paper that's behind it. And what I personally feel is very important when you think about data quality, it will fully only work if you try to calculate it, because theoretically you can have many, many interesting theoretical thoughts. When you bring it into algorithms and see how data is necessary, it shows you where weaknesses are. And we see the more we apply our concept, we also see the ways where we need to further modify it, because it must be seamless when you apply it to data.
Thanks a lot. I think that makes sense.
Are there more questions or comments from the audience? Otherwise, I have a question. One of the dimensions you mentioned for data quality is completeness. And this makes absolute sense if you are dealing with structured data. And I'm, as a social scientist, I'm more into structured data. So all these dimensions seem to be very logical to me, but we have a lot of people in our audience who might not deal with typical structured data, but more with like unstructured data. And what I was wondering about, this is questions maybe also to you, but also to the audience, how completeness can be measured when we talk about unstructured data. Maybe.
I would like to add one minor comment. It can be very difficult with very structured data to deal with completeness. For example, if you deal with health routine data, contrary to studies, there is not this fixed set of variables that needs to be measured. So when the recordings you look at, something might have been written down, but it's not in the data you see. Some things might have been performed, but did not reach the reimbursement pipeline. And so a lot of times you will not see, is something missing? And a very applied example, if something is important for reimbursement, like if I code diabetes, it will be fairly accurate. If it is not so important, like smoking, well, you will sparsely find it in the data. And so you have, through the back door in highly structured data, severe missing problems that cannot be appropriately answered. You only know that it is inadequately addressed. But then, yes, what you just mentioned, that would be quite interesting, because especially with texts, and of course we also have texts as well that we assess. For instance, I hopefully receive a comment from other, from culture, for example, cultural field of research. As far as texts are concerned, with pathology reports, for example, what is precisely in there? It's very hard to come up with a full range of completeness measures, but at least in terms of diagnosis or potential diagnosis, there should be something in there. So if this is not the case, it is something that is missing. And in this sense, you could identify kind of quality metrics for what should be in a good histology report, and then search, is it in there or is it not in there?
Okay, is there anybody who could talk about this point which Carsten Schmidt just raised? Okay. I have the feeling that everything was said. And so in case there are no further comments or questions, I would again thank you for your really nice talk and introduction in how the NFDI for Health is dealing with data quality. And I think this is just the starting point. And it's very interesting for others to see how you are dealing with it, and to make some more thoughts about how we, from this starting point on, we can work on a common ground for data quality. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody in the audience, in Zoom or on YouTube.
Thank you. Bye-bye.